Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of The Conquered and the Proud, this series of talks about Roman history between 200 BC and, well, we'll probably go just about up to 200 AD. So a big chunk, 4 centuries of basically the central period of Roman history, the rise of the Republic to control the Mediterranean, to becoming this dominant power in that region, the civil wars, collapse of the Republic, creation of the Principate, and the rule of emperors, and the period in which that flourished, as did population, economy, all the other things. So it's a big topic, and a lot of these themes we touch upon, inevitably we're not going to be able to go into in much detail. Now, there's been quite a long break since I last released one of these. Other things have got in the way. We've been doing the Q&A sessions, and then there have just been other topics that seemed like a good fit for the particular month where I was doing things. So, bit of a break. Last time we did one on the early career of Octavian, the young Caesar, the man who'll become Caesar Augustus. Today we're going to carry that further, and we'll look at the regime he created. And next time we'll go on and we'll do Augustus and the provinces, because that's another big issue. Even splitting this effectively, Augustus' career, into 3, we're still covering a lot of things very, very thinly, and some important aspects not at all. So it's something to remember throughout, and I'm glad people are enjoying these enough to want to comment. Every talk I give, you could cover far more. You could go into it in far greater depth. The idea of these is them to be an introduction, but an introduction to give you some idea of the sort of things that ancient historians talk about. I can't go into all the theories in great detail. We might do that in the future. So if there's something you think, oh, he really ought to have talked about that, well, fine, put it in the comments, and I can probably get around to it at some point. But it's just trying to... This was supposed to be... last time's talk was supposed to be part of this one, and we'd look at the rise of Augustus and this in one session. But it's just too much, and although it's now, 14 odd years... No, 10 years ago, since my biography of Augustus came out. Having looked at the topic in that sort of detail means that there's far more I could talk about, and a book like that, pretty much each chapter could become a book of its own with very little difficulty, and to encompass the full scholarly debate on some of these subjects would mean you'd be going on and on and on. So, as I say, we're really trying to introduce things, give some sense of how we try and approach it, what the evidence is, what the sources are, the problems of using it, and the different theories, the different interpretations. But remember, there'll be far more to every topic than I can possibly cover in one of these sessions. And I'm still aiming for about an hour each session, but, well, you know me by now, that doesn't always work out. Anyway, last time we looked at the rise of Augustus, and again, you've got to remind people, this is someone who's barely 19 when they thrust themselves into the heart of Roman politics at a time when that political regime has been very violent for a long period. You've just had the big civil war between Caesar and his opponents. You've had Julius Caesar being murdered. Everything seems to be lurching towards a similar breakdown in normal, peaceful elections, transition of power, all this sort of thing. The prospect of more civil wars. So it's remarkable that any teenager, as he was, would have not so much the immense self-confidence to do this, but the ability to get away with it. Mark Antony dismissed him as a boy who owes everything to a name. The name's important, but without the talent, without the ruthless ambition, without the cleverness, the political acumen, then none of that would have mattered. The name was only a name in the end. He had far more than that. Nevertheless, there's a danger that we fall into the other trap, and this is the sort of simplistic view of history that's very purely personality-based, but then makes the personalities simple. And that's to see the 19-year-old or the 25-year-old in the rise to power as the fully formed article, the fully formed Caesar Augustus, with all the dignitas, the gravitas, the attributes of a Roman statesman, but also with this laser-sharp and laser-precise political insight, so that he understands the situation, he understands how people think, and he has this very clear idea of, this is where I want to get to, this is the end point, this is the regime I'm going to create with me at its head. Because A, that doesn't make a lot of sense in that very few people have their ideas as sharply formed as that from the very beginning and then do not deviate from them at any to any degree at any stage. But also it's very, very clear that the first few decades of Augustus's life are very much a question of trial and error. He didn't know he was going to succeed. He also didn't know that he was going to live as long as he did. Now, last time we brought it up to 30 BC and the suicides of Antony and then Cleopatra a few days later, just over a week. Antony, of course, was the big deal. Cleopatra was the bugbear of propaganda. It was much easier to fight a civil war against this decadent, sinister Greek Eastern queen than it was to say, well, actually, I just want to fight a war against my fellow Roman, my former brother-in-law, Mark Antony, who's been such a good chap up until now, but suddenly, oh, how did I never realise this before, has turned into an absolute scoundrel and a danger to the state. Much harder to motivate a weary population to fight yet another civil war about the political rivalries. There's not a great ideological difference in any of these conflicts. Briefly with Brutus and Cassius when they're proclaiming liberty and the need to assassinate a dictator, but their behaviour is exactly like all the other warlords of this era, just as ruthless, just as determined, and let's face it, however altruistic they felt they were, and in Brutus's case perhaps he did, they would be the people who would emerge as the leaders of the Republic that they were hoping to restore. So there's self-interest as well, but then that's the nature of politics. You don't do anything without ambition and personal ambition, because you wouldn't bother to go through all the unpleasant and, in the Roman case, dangerous tasks that are required to get that far. Now, when Antony dies in 30 BC, how many people could possibly have guessed that Augustus will still be there in AD 14, will die in his bed as a very old man? Yes, you can go down the I Claudius route and imply some sort of sinister plots going on behind it and poisoning and all this sort of thing, but the odds are this is a very elderly man who has been sick repeatedly, particularly in the first half of his life. There are several occasions where pretty much everybody, including apparently Augustus himself, despairs of life, expect him to die, and then there's the question of, well, what's going to happen next? He has 44 years as the supreme leader within the Roman state. Nobody can match him. After Actium, after the fall of Antony, he's in command of 60-odd legions. Now, we'll look in more detail at the army next time. He'll reduce that to 28. He'll organise the army, sort of institutionalise best practice to some extent, or what he perceived to be best practice. It organises the auxiliary troops more. You can just see a standardisation, a sort of sense of everybody doing things the same way and having much the same equipment, to a far greater degree than before. Everything's a bit neater. The camps built by Augustus's army, particularly as the years go by, are far more regular, conform much more closely to what's emerged as a standard design. You can see it there before, but it is far more pronounced. So Augustus is around for a long time, and that's another reason why it's a great mistake to just assume, well, he knows what he's going to do, and this is, the plan is there, and it's all simple, and he all just makes it work. Because it wasn't. I mean, scholars habitually refer to the first and second settlements, the different approaches he adopted to how he would lead the state, what he would be, what this regime would look like, what his individual powers would be, the extent to which he influenced or controlled events, and there is clearly trial and error. And the general view that seems pretty reasonable in many respects is that early on he goes for fairly blatant power. So in the early years he tends to be consul almost every year, if not every year, and that seems to be the basis. The problem with that is, yes, that's the traditional senior magistracy of the Roman Republic. You have a colleague, but it's fairly clear that this colleague doesn't control the armies of Augustus, and in the early years you're not going to get to be able to stand and certainly get elected without his considerable favour. So you're a reliable sort of chap, otherwise you wouldn't be there. But it is blatant. It's very obviously Augustus is consul again and again and again, and whilst people like Marius have broken the traditional pattern, and Caesar and others have done this, it does rather parade your power and your status. Now, The triumvirs themselves and Augustus very carefully avoided the term dictator, so he's not going to be a dictator for life as Julius Caesar had been. But if you're effectively consul every year, what message does that send? The other problem is as well, you've still got an aristocracy that craves all the things Republican aristocrats have craved for a long time. All the things we've talked about in earlier sessions of this series. They want high office, they want fame, they want the opportunity to go out and control a province and lead an army in battle. They want glory, they want status, they want to add to the reputation of their family, pass it on to their sons, as something that's improved, something that will add to their chances of high office. And obviously if Augustus is consul every year, then that means you're reducing the opportunities of others, that there's not as many jobs to go around. So you have this, but it's very much, again, the danger is with this, and it's something that writing a biography helps you to avoid, because when you write a biography, you're looking at where the person is, where that individual is and what he's doing at any one time. It's so easy, if you're just analysing it from the historian's perspective, to see the grand sweep and to say, well, you know, this is clearly the end result, this is what Augustus is aiming at, and it's just a question of putting the building blocks in place until I've got this new constitution organised. But we forget that he is very, very busy. He is travelling around a lot, so there's a lot to do. And while next time we'll talk far more about what's going on in the provinces, it's still worth reminding ourselves that he isn't always in Italy. You know, he's not there. He's got to go off and do other tasks. He's got to be dealing with all the chaos that has been created by the latest civil war, but all the civil wars behind that. Administering Italy, the provinces, individual communities, there are lots of problems that need someone in authority to resolve, whether it's a governor or ultimately effectively the governor's decision is, if it goes against what Augustus wants, probably isn't going to last. And we'll look far more next time about also the great advantage this had for provincials once they identified that there was somebody in charge at Rome, and that if you got to Augustus or one of his close associates, then the decision they gave you, if you could get them to make a ruling on your particular case, was going to hold up, was going to be enforced. It's much easier than when you've got magistrates that change every year, when you've got trying to influence, well, who's important in the Senate enough to raise our issue for you. So there's a lot of work for Augustus to do. He is a very busy man, simply doing things. He's travelling a lot. Again, a reminder, he spends more of his life away from Rome and away from Italy than he does there. And that's easy to forget. And even when he's there, he's very, very busy. So there is not a great deal of time to sit down and plan in a sort of abstract, theoretical, ideal sense of, oh, well, this is what we'd like. You also have to do something in the meantime. You know, Rome needs a government. The Republic needs a government. He famously boasts in the Res Gestae that he restores the Republic, the Res Publica, the Commonwealth again. It's probably the best translation we've got when it had fallen under control of a faction. Tacitus is far more cynical, sees this as just basically he is the last warlord standing, having bumped off everybody else. Nevertheless, it works on the basis of giving people enough of a sense of legitimate government as that they can live with, they can cope with. There is a great tendency, there's a simplicity in the argument that still gets raised now and again to say, well, Julius Caesar gets murdered. That means whatever he was doing, the way he was running Rome, was provocative, annoying to very many people, really disturbing, and therefore he was killed. Augustus is tactful, is far more diplomatic in the way he deals with people, far more subtle, far smarter than Julius Caesar, because he creates a regime that works and he dies in his bed as an old man. That's fine, but the problem is Caesar had very little time in Rome, as we've said in the earlier talks on him. He's busy fighting the civil war for much of the period he's dictator, and he's got all sorts of problems. There's this great backlog of problems, of issues, of things that are not working. So he's trying to make the state function again, and as just the same as Augustus, but he has far less time to do it. There's also a big difference that he is living and trying to do this 15, 20 years earlier. Since then, you've had more civil war. You've had Brutus and Cassius proclaim liberty, peace, freedom, all that sort of stuff, and say we had to kill a dictator because it was contrary to the basic principles of how the Republic functioned. But that only led to more civil war, to more exploitation of the provinces to provide soldiers, food, pay for the armies with which these leaders fight for power. Those later civil wars did two things. They further culled the ranks of the Roman aristocracy. There is that great tendency. The people who stand out, tend to be the ones who fall, who get killed because they end up on the wrong side and they draw attention and they're too important to ignore. So a lot more people have died, and on top of that, the futility of civil war has been made very, very plain, because it doesn't really matter who's in charge. Most of them seem to behave in much the same way, and what everyone's desperate for by the time of Actium, it's building up before, is stability. They don't want more civil war. They want internal peace. They want to feel that they still own their farm, their estates, and they will do next month, next year. They're not going to be confiscated to give as rewards to the officers and soldiers of one of the warlords. They want to feel that if they have a problem, if they have a legal case to make, it can go to court and it will be reasonably fairly dealt with. But also that the courts are meeting, that the state is functioning, and that things aren't just in limbo because nobody really knows who's in charge at any time. So there's this desperate longing for peace, stability, for an end to this civil war that seems so pointless. So that's something that Augustus has on his side very much, but it doesn't mean that it's plain sailing and that it's easy. It's simply he can ride the tide, he can follow the mood of the people and give them what they want rather more easily than was the case for Caesar, and he's also got more time to do it. He's not faced with a major civil war after 30 BC. There are some issues, and there are still prominent aristocrats around, but most of the big names are dead or are loyal to you. You now control the army, and you'll take ever greater care to do that. Again, as I say, this is something we'll develop next time when we look at the Augustan system in the provinces and how that works. So he is able to develop this, but this is very much trial and error. It's fits and starts. There are mistakes. The first settlement in 27 BC, again, it's a modern term for it, it leaves the power very blatant. As I say, he's consul every year. He controls, as his province, most of the empire directly. There are signs he's developing a palace complex on top of the Palatine Hill with a grand entrance that parading his power. It invokes all sorts of ideas that are deeply entrenched in the Greco-Roman aristocratic mentality of tyrants, of overmighty kings. This will all change. Everything will be more subtle in what we call the second settlement, which we place in 23 BC. And for instance, then he will make sure that the approach to his house follows along the road on the slopes of the Palatine where all the grand houses of all the aristocrats are. And there was an element, people like Marius and Sulla at their height had got to live there. Pompey had got to live there. This was where it showed you'd made it, that you were someone who mattered within the Roman state, simply by the physical location of your house and the fact that Carandini and others in the Italian archaeologists have worked on this area and discovered these houses that are very, very ancient. These are ancestral homes. They've been developed, they've changed, but some of them go back really to the early Republic, and it is like living in the most fashionable, poshest, but deeply established part of London or any of the big cities. It's very much a sign that you have made it because you are here. So Augustus has his own house is bigger because it ends up with several houses knocked together. There's a temple of Apollo almost joined onto it. It becomes a far bigger thing, but it's presented as just another aristocratic house, just a bit higher up the hill and a bit bigger than everybody else's, and you have to come past everyone else. So the whole emphasis within this new regime is that Augustus is the most distinguished servant of the Republic and the state, but he is a servant of the state. He is a magistrate of the state. He leads because that's what the people want, and he is doing a good job in the interests of all. So his power is veiled to some extent, and there are two elements to it, one of which is paraded openly. This is the tribunician potestas, the power of the tribunate. Now obviously these are the tribunes like the Gracchi and others who've featured, who've played such a role in the development of the Republic, the disturbances of the late Republic, but it is a hallowed ancient office that is distinct from the other magistracies. It has a different political year. You take up office in December rather than January. Different elections, only open to plebeians, although of course now, because he's made himself adopted son of Caesar, Augustus himself is a patrician, but then he's not holding the office of tribune. He is having the powers and the sacrosanct nature of his person. There is something special. The tribunes were the people who were supposed to stand up for the rights of ordinary citizens, of everybody, of the entire citizen body. And they had their right of veto. They had their right to protect individuals from the abuse of power by magistrates. They could bring laws and present laws to the popular assembly, as of course the Gracchi and others had done. But it has a very useful association. This is very much, for all that's happened, for all the disturbances with tribunes, there is still a deep-seated sense that being a tribune means you're on the right side of the debate, that you are there to defend and protect the people, the citizen body of Rome. It's useful in that because he can also summon the Senate. He has the powers in the same way that a tribune could, and the assembly, if he wants to, well, that will become less and less common. Rarely, if ever, does he summon the assembly, and there is a move away from that old pattern of the Gracchi and others where you got the Roman people together and you would push your legislation through, how people like Pompey and Caesar had got their extraordinary commands, all this sort of thing. Augustus remodels it. The speaker's platform, the rostra you see there in the forum today, that's the Augustan version, and it's a different shape. The earlier one was rounder, and the whole thing, it's looking towards the forum. The other one, the orientation suggests it was more for gathering large groups of the Roman people. This is more about being part of the state. It's sort of one element. It's one instrument in the orchestra that's joining together to, even when it's playing a solo, to combine to make the theme that you all follow. The second power is not emphasized in the same way, and it's the imperium proconsulare maius, the power to command, to dispense justice, the imperium. Again, we've talked about this right back at the start. We were looking at how the Roman political system works, of a proconsul. So you're no longer consul every year. That means there's 2 posts from the very start of the year, and then this pattern is that you will also have replacement suffect consuls, so most people don't serve out their 12-month. It gives you a chance to reward other suitable good chaps who've supported you by giving them a spell as consul, allowing them to say they're a former consul. It ennobles the family and adds to their dignitas, but also means you can get more through the system. Not pushed to the extreme of Julius Caesar, where you'd had lots of people being rewarded, and of course the infamous consul for a day, Caninius Rebilus, who was, because one of the incumbents died in office, Caesar appointed a supporter, so that the man was, as Cicero joked, well, he never closed his eyes, never slept, was ever vigilant throughout his entire term of office, because he's only there for a day. That had made things look ridiculous and cheapened the consulship. Augustus makes sure that the dignity, the status of the consuls are enhanced, but also at the same time their political initiative is diminished to the point where it disappears almost altogether. So he has this power. It means that because his power is greater than any proconsul, that effectively he can command, or at least outrank, any provincial governor, anyone out there in charge of a province, in charge of an army. Now again, As I say, I know I keep saying this, but we will look in more detail at how the provincial government system works next time. So it's a big, big deal. He has a large province permanently allocated to himself that contains almost all of the army. There's one, occasionally two legions outside it in the Africa proconsulare, the proconsular province of Africa that is still allocated to a former magistrate by the Senate, has a legion there. The rest of the army, the vast bulk of the army, is in provinces controlled by Augustus, which are governed by his legati, his representatives. Again, we talked about this a little bit in other videos, and we will do far more on this over the months and years to come. They do not have imperium of their own. They have imperium delegated from Augustus, dependent upon him. The soldiers there take an oath not to the legate but to Augustus. When they get their pay, it's in the name of Augustus, and this will eventually be extended to the entire Roman army wherever they're stationed. Rewards, promotions, decorations, all of these things come from Augustus. You take an oath to Caesar Augustus and the Senatus Populesque, the Senate and people of Rome. So they're his representatives. That's a big, big deal. That's a big, big change. At the same time, elections effectively end. And Augustus nominates the magistrates, so he controls their careers, because obviously if you do want any real chance of military glory, unless you're lucky enough to get Africa and there happens to be a war on at the time, and even worse, because the wars in that area prove pretty tough quite often, you can actually win it, then you really want to end up having enough favour with Augustus to be appointed a legate of one of his provinces that gives you command of a decent army. That means that if you win a war, it will be credited to him, but you will get some share in the glory. It's less. So almost all senior posts are effectively at his disposal. There are also greatly increased career opportunities for the equestrian order. Now, I've done the video about the army in Judea under Pontius Pilate and all that sort of thing, and talked a little bit about the different status of governors. I think there might have been another video, have we done, about equestrians, but we certainly will. I want to do that. You're basically taking a section of the population that has become involved in military service, in provincial government, these sorts of things, at various times, but you're formalizing it all. It's part of that trend towards making everything more regular, but you're taking a large section of particularly the population of Italy, the country gentry, the well-to-do of the many towns of Italy, towns and cities, and also extending that to the many other communities of Roman citizens, whether colonies, municipia, towns given Roman status, that are there in southern Gaul, are there in the Spanish provinces, are there in Syria, are there in Greece, North Africa. The citizens from there who have sufficient wealth become members of this order, and they have an opportunity for a formal career within the imperial service. So they can be army officers, commanders of auxiliary units, junior tribunes in a legion. They can be governors of smaller provinces, as Judea will be. They can be imperial procurators, financial officials in the bigger provinces. There are other posts. So you're involving far more people in the imperial system, in the administration. Augustus the cat is just leaving us, having sat beside me, preening himself for a while. Obviously he considers his work is done. The empire is now stable, so he'll go off and do some heavy-duty sleeping somewhere, probably on my office chair. I guess it's notable that he's probably approving more what I've been saying, because we haven't had any cries of protest, as we often seem to get in these talks. Anyway, sorry, I'm wandering off the point. Oh no, there he goes. He is making his presence felt. Obviously he wanted to make clear I can't take him for granted. Anyway, right, so this is a fundamental change in these powers and the way the system works. If you look at a lot of coins, inscriptions, the thing that is emphasized is the tribunician power. So you get trib, pot on, as the abbreviations, on lots of inscriptions, and then a number. And that's the number of years that the princeps, whether it's Augustus or his successors, have held that tribunician power. It becomes the system of dating your reign. effectively. And it's interesting that you choose this one that is, in a sense, the most tactful one, the one that has this aura of the past, of a proper republic, of protecting citizens, of being the citizen's defender, in a sense, rather than emphasizing the proconsular imperium, which in the control of the army, which is obviously ultimately the basis of why you're there and why you're in charge. Again, there's the joke supposedly told by a philosopher who's been arguing with the Emperor Hadrian later on, and Hadrian's corrected him on a point, and the philosopher sort of accepted it, even though Hadrian's wrong. And afterwards, when asked about this, he said, well, you don't argue with somebody who controls 30 legions. Not 30 at this stage, but it's still, the principle is there. This is the man who controls the army. Augustus is ultimately a warlord, a military dictator, even if he scrupulously avoids the term dictator. And he's a pretty decent one. He rules pretty well, and the empire prospers under him, but that doesn't alter the fact that he is able to do all that he does because he has a monopoly of military might. So that's the formal powers he has, but obviously a lot of politics, particularly in a Roman context, in the context of the ancient world, works rather less formally than that. So, big differences that have occurred. The people no longer vote. They are not the ones passing laws. They've only ever had the opportunity to say yes, no to legislation, but for the first time under Augustus, the Senate's decrees, the Senatus Consulta, will gain the authority of law. They effectively become a ruling, and it doesn't have to go through the Roman people. Now, partly this is acknowledgement as well that the Roman people who assembled in Rome were only a very small proportion of the entire citizen population, which has risen to 4 million plus during Augustus's reign, and we're not quite sure whether that's counting women and children or just adult males. There's a lot of Romans around. Many of them live a very long way away from Rome and will never see the city. And even though you get legionaries on their tombstones emphasizing I belong to this particular voting tribe, the chances are none of them had ever voted, even before that. So the people don't get that direct power they had before to ratify treaties, declarations of war, and pass laws and elect people. There are still elections for a while. This is a gradual thing, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, but the elections are from candidates chosen by Augustus. You have a few cases where, after he's given up being consul for the year, the people are still voting for him as consul, which is an interesting sign of his popularity and that general relief that someone was in charge and making the trains run on time, or the equivalent, but making the courts work, making the streets relatively safe, making the roads good enough to travel on, making the whole system work. Augustus is very, very visible. One of the things he made sure to do is provide the public entertainments. Now, we've just had the second Gladiator movie that's unlike the first one, seems to be trying to say, well, just shows how decadent the Romans are. They like this violent entertainment. Well, some of the entertainment wasn't quite as violent as Hollywood would make out. A lot of gladiatorial fights didn't end in death. Nevertheless, it's still pretty brutal. You are throwing people to the wild beasts for punishment. You are having professional hunters killing wild animals for your amusement, and gladiators do sometimes kill each other. Frequently enough for this to be an extremely dangerous profession that, surprisingly, some people volunteer to do, but most are compelled to do. But he makes sure that he's there, he's at the theatre, and it's emphasized. Suetonius tells us that Julius Caesar used to, whilst he was presiding over the games, he would have several scribes on the go and he would be dictating letters or listening to correspondence. He'd basically be working. Yes, I'm there, I've shown up, I know you like this sort of thing, but there's so much to do, I've got to do it. And, I can't just switch off. Augustus makes it a great effort to show that he's interested, that he's enjoying the pursuits, the amusements of the people. He is not, I'm at the games, I'm going to watch the games. I'm not here to carry on with work, and I'm not here grudgingly. I respect you, in a sense. There's almost that element to it. And I'll listen to you when you start chanting and cheering and asking for things. I'm not necessarily going to give you what you want or what you're asking for, but nevertheless, I will listen. You have stories of him gaming, playing dice. Like many Romans, he was obsessed with gambling and dice games. But again, that's what a lot of the crowd is doing in the intervals between the main acts, the main fights, the main races, all of this sort of thing. So he starts to develop venues for this, the Circus Maximus in particular. You also have the Theatre of Marcellus, built there, that now is, it's the one where they've converted it into sort of houses, apartments above it some time ago. So it's that slightly odd looking one now. But he's there and he listens to what the crowd says and he acts upon it, as I say, not always giving them what they want, but nevertheless he's there. He also walks through the streets of Rome to get to these entertainments, to get to wherever the Senate is meeting. The curia that had been burned down in the funeral of Clodius that Julius Caesar had planned and started to rebuild is completed under Augustus. That's the one in modified form. It's been rebuilt subsequently, but it seems to be exactly the same design. They just repeat the one you see today. He develops all this area, but he walks there. He is one citizen among many, and in the streets he is accessible. You have these stories of people accosting him with petitions, and there's a famous one, in this collection of jokes told about Augustus, ones he told and ones that were told about him, where he's every day as he comes out of his house and goes to do his business, there's this would-be poet is hanging around declaiming verses in praise of Augustus, hoping to get money, basically. And Augustus ignores him for days and days. The bloke still keeps turning up and trying this spiel. Augustus then decides to play a trick on him, and he goes over and hands the fellow a scroll with some poetry of his own. Now the poet, thinking on his feet, gives Augustus a coin, a very small coin, and apologizes, says, "Oh, this is great, I'd love to give you more, but that's all I can afford," at which point Augustus orders somebody to give him a bag of money. But it's that accessibility. This is not the great king in whose presence you should be awed, you should be prostrating yourself on the floor, kissing the hem of their robe, kissing their feet, that sort of thing. This is very much an accessible magistrate, one citizen, but one citizen amongst many. Primus inter pares, first among the equals. All these concepts you have that affect not just the Senate, but the wider population. That feeling that we are all part of the state, we are all citizens, we are all Romans. And that, yes, I may be more distinguished, wealthier, more important than you, I might make grand decisions, but in the end, I'm one of you, I'm very much on your side, and you can talk to me. I can't promise to see everybody every time, but nevertheless, I'm accessible, I'm doing this. Yes, there is obviously some security around me. Yes, I have the Praetorian Guard based in Rome, we'll talk about them in a bit. But that still doesn't mean that I'm isolated from you. You can reach me, you can get to me, you can talk to me, you can ask me for things. And this extends to the public performances at entertainments and things. Again, Augustus is there, Augustus is visible when he's in Rome. Remember that more than half the time he isn't, but when he's away, somebody else like Agrippa or family members will be there doing the same thing that he does whilst he's in Rome. So there's frequent public feasting, and that's another opportunity to show that you care, you're interested, and it's benevolence. You're doing favours for people. You have cases where Livia, Augustus's wife, will entertain the women of Rome. So you sort of have a parallel system there of this. It's like the old patronage system where patrons were expected to entertain and indulge their clients in reward for the loyalty, the service of those clients. It's a two-way relationship, really. And you have the grain dole continues. It's reduced in terms of the numbers, but you are for the poor and for citizens who don't have enough to support their families, then the state takes some care of them. So there's an element of bread and circuses. We've talked about this in one of the Q&A videos. That's there from the start. You indulge the population of Rome in particular, but in other cities, local magistrates will be doing much the same there. It's much bigger in scale in Rome. But you've also got a military force, a garrison now established in Rome for the first time ever. Armed bodies of troops were not supposed to be within the city boundary in the past, other than in certain circumstances like a triumph. They came in cases of emergency, but this was always a questionable thing. Augustus creates the Praetorian Guard. Now, a legion consists of 10 cohorts. surely deliberately Augustus chose to have 9 cohorts of Praetorian guards. So we don't quite know how big they were. If they were the sort of 480, 500-ish, then you're looking at 4 to 4,500 rather than the 5,000 or so of a legion. So it's slightly smaller than a legion. More important than that, there are only ever 3 cohorts under him in Rome at any one time. I think sometime a video on the Praetorians, the urban cohort, and the Vigiles will probably make sense, because it's better to do in one place, and we can look at their development as well. So you have 1,500, unless these were stronger than normal cohorts, troops at your disposal in Rome itself, but that's it's not a vast number in a city whose population numbers 1 million. You've got urban cohorts that are sort of paramilitary police force, less formally soldiers than the Praetorian Guards, but they're still organised in that sort of military sense. And then the Vigiles, the night police, fire brigade, that try and keep some sort of order in Rome at night, and also stop Rome burning down. Think back to the talk we did on the first triumvirate, where Crassus, part of his wealth was based on his creation of a fire brigade that would go in and, after he'd bought up property in the path of a fire at a knockdown price, they would then demolish houses to create a fire breaks, and then afterwards he'd have other people come in and rebuild the houses, repair those, so that he could then rent them out. That's been an informal thing. Augustus formalizes this and takes control, but he does this after a scare. In 19 BC, a chap called Ignatius Rufus creates his own fire brigade and attempts some sort of revolution. The details are not there, but this seems to be the last case where you have the Senatus Consultum Ultimum is invoked. Augustus was not in Rome at the time, and Ignatius Rufus and his supporters seem to have aimed at some sort of revolution. They are violently suppressed. He is executed. After that, you get the Vigiles. Augustus says, well, I can't take that risk anymore, so we'll have something, but I will control it. So again, there was a need. Rome is desperately overcrowded. Again, we'll do more talks on the city itself and its infrastructure. But remember, a lot of people are living in these insulae, these high-rise blocks of flats that are pretty poorly built, upper stories with lots of timber, hot Italian summer anyway, everything very crowded. The Senate has passed regulation after regulation over the years on how high a building could be, how they were supposed to be built, safety precautions essentially, that are clearly, the fact you're repeating this suggests they're being ignored because landlords just want the money. Rome has grown upwards rather than outwards because you have to be within walking distance of all the entertainments to make it worth your while living in Rome in the first place. So it's incredibly crowded and densely built, densely constructed with highly flammable material. So fires in Rome are a very serious risk and a really great danger, not just to life, but also you can lose all your property as well, even if you escape. That's pretty devastating. So you have these security measures, but again, it's hard to see it at this stage as this is someone who wants to maintain control against political opponents in the city by military force. It's more to do with realizing, well, actually, we've got this vast city. It's a dangerous place. It's an unstable place. We do need some sort of military and paramilitary force to keep control, because otherwise there is a risk of all sorts of danger. And of course, so much of the political violence of the late Republic that had torn it apart had occurred in Rome, and had begun with rioting, and you'd had the gangs of Clodius and Milo and others. So it makes sense to have the ability to stop that by brute force if necessary. In the main, you're trying to encourage people not to do that sort of thing by making their life better, more stable, make it worth their while to keep you in power. Now, you've got that. You've also got the Senate. Now, the Senate had risen to not far short of 1,000 members, particularly under Julius Caesar, who'd rewarded lots of his supporters. And, you get all these jokes in Cicero about the Gauls from mostly some Cisalpine Gaul, some Transalpine Gaul, who'd taken off their trousers, put on a toga, and then couldn't find the way to the Senate house because they were citizens already, but Caesar had made them senators as well. Augustus purges it. He reduces it in stages, eventually back to, first of all, down to the sort of Sullan size of 600. There may be some attempts to get it even smaller, down to 300, but in the end it will end up back mostly at the 600 mark. because there's just enough people out there who are keen for this dignity. He attends the Senate as a member. He does not preside on every occasion. Magistrates, properly elected magistrates, or at least by the new system of election and appointment, do this. But he attends, he debates, he accepts criticism. The problem, the difficulty, all of this is that he makes a great display of showing respect to the Senate, and claims to encourage free debate. He becomes princeps senatus, the senior member of the Senate, listed formally on the roll produced by the censors. Censorship is something Augustus has revived, tried to get going again, taken a personal role in doing. That affects the whole citizen body, from senators to the humblest and poorest. But making it, again, it comes back to this, making things work. Our old institutions, taking them, perhaps reforming them a bit, but making sure they actually function. Senatus Consulta has the force of law, as I've mentioned, so a Senate's decree now actually counts. The Senate can decide things. They have gained power, and they also now act as a court, particularly for serious charges involving senators, this sort of thing. But the problem is that everybody knows that their career depends on the favour of Augustus. If you want to have a military command, if you want to have provinces, you're going to have to make sure that the emperor likes you and approves of you. You vote him honour after honour. This is something that happened under Caesar. You know, much of the excessive trappings of the dictatorship were given to Caesar he hadn't asked for, and in some cases he refuses them, but there's then the problem that you upset people. And you've got that whole case, and again I think we've talked about before in the one on Caesar's dictatorship, where he's writing documents when a delegation of senators arrives to tell him they voted him even more honours. He doesn't rise to greet them. Now, as dictator, he wasn't, in fact, shouldn't do that. But nevertheless, if he had risen, well, that would have been a breach of precedent. But the fact that he didn't was shown as disrespect to the Senate. So there's this basic problem that Augustus turns down an awful lot of the honours that are voted to him and accepts others. But lots of people are thinking, well, I want a really good career. So let's be as grovelling and fawning to the emperor as I possibly can, because that way he might like me. That's human nature. Others, as they had with Caesar, are probably thinking, well, actually, I don't like this man, so if I embarrass him by being excessively fawning, then he can't criticise me, because after all, look, I'm just saying you're wonderful and I think you deserve these great honours, but it makes him look bad. Augustus walks the tightrope better than Caesar had managed, again, partly because he's got more opportunity to do it and the threats are less. But it is difficult. But they do vote him lots of honours. Eventually he gets the name Augustus. Now there is talk in the sources that he'd considered actually taking the name of Romulus. You know, Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who found Rome, and then Romulus kills Remus with a spade. That's obviously an incredibly powerful name. You're the new founder of the city. And it suggests that earlier period where his power is very, very blatant, that maybe he's thinking of these things and then realises, actually, this is probably a bad idea. I need to be a little more subtle, a little more tactful. Augustus, again, is so familiar to us that we perhaps don't understand how strange a name it was. It has these quasi-religious overtones. It has this sense of grandeur of the past, of all that is right and all that is proper, of all that is dignified. But of course it's less specific, because Romulus had a fairly ambiguous reputation. Yes, he's the founder of Rome. Yes, he starts Rome off onto the path that will lead it to world empire. But also, apart from murdering his brother, there was one tradition that he was carried up to heaven at the end of his life. There was another tradition that he was torn to pieces by angry senators, and that they couldn't find any bits of the body. You know, he was reduced to so many small fragments. That's obviously a very dodgy thing, and it's not something you want anyone to be thinking about too closely. So instead he goes for Augustus. He becomes pater patriae, the father of his country. Now again, it wasn't entirely new, but this would become a fundamental point. There was a mark of an emperor that was when the Senate approved you, when they wanted to show their favour, gave you this title, and the good emperors felt that they had to deserve it, whereas the bad emperors just assumed, well, they ought to have it anyway. But this is a big deal. So he becomes Caesar Augustus, and it's part of his success that he is gaining these sorts of honours that adds so much to the grandeur about him. We'll talk a bit more about his image in a moment. It's not really free debate, though, in the Senate because of this, because of all these pressures on people, and because they realise in the end this is the man who controls 28 legions and just as many auxiliary soldiers. There's even, talk of daft debates when Augustus telling people, look, I really want you to express your opinion, and then somebody saying, well, what opinion would you like us to express? Because we want to please you. We think you're better. We think you're great. That's what we're saying to you. You're leading the state so well. So what do you want of us? It works both ways. You do also there are stories where some people did criticize it or did raise issues he didn't want, and he took care not to lose his temper. We're told that there's this trick he had, that when he felt his temper rising and he was about to lose it and deliver, what's the expression, the best speech you'll ever regret, when you speak in haste and passion, but and possibly with great eloquence. Instead, he would recite the alphabet silently in his head, just to calm himself down and sort of take a deep breath and then reply. Or one or two occasions where he left the Senate, thought, I can't stay here because I'm going to say something that I can't pull back. So Augustus works hard. This isn't straightforward. It isn't a simple switch that comes in, yes, he's all powerful, everybody grovels to him. But the trend obviously is that everyone realises, I need his favour, and generally speaking they expect, well, he's going to get what he wants anyway, so we might as well go along with it. Which of course makes the Senate less useful. Now, early on in his reign, and for much of the reign till his last few years, he had this concilium principes, this council of the princeps, of the leaders, where men were chosen at random from the Senate, plus people Augustus had picked, and plus some of his family, whoever was his, who would meet before senatorial meetings and independently to talk about the issues, discuss them. It was a sounding board, really. It gave a chance to hear other people's opinions in a rather less open, public and grand setting than a meeting of the Senate, so that he could start to think, okay, maybe people wouldn't like that, but they'd like it if I do it this way. In the last years of his reign, this becomes an entirely selected body, probably to do with the preparations for Tiberius to take over. So its usefulness in this sense is reduced, but it is important that he is trying to get a sense of what people think, what the aristocracy think, because their opinion does matter, and you can ride roughshod over them, but only for so long. And if you want the system to work, you really want to carry people with you, persuade them, and convince everybody, give everyone the feeling that you are doing a good thing. So it's in his last year, this will be reduced to, again, a purely selected body that you've chosen, and that random element goes, which probably reduces its effectiveness. So that's basically the institutional look at Augustus. We've got Augustus's image as a big issue, and it's something that successive scholars have studied in considerable detail. This is somebody who had started out as a 19-year-old who had fought and murdered his way to power. He'd executed lots of opponents. This is these stories about him dispensing justice in the early days, where moriendum esse, you must die. It's necessary for you to die. And Maecenas, one of his main advisors, sort of having to tell him, calm down, leave off judgment for today, you're just getting too harsh. He's got that same sort of reputation Pompey had as the young butcher. And the Romans see it as worse in someone so young. So he's got to move from that to the father of his country, Augustus, the first among equals, all of these things. The man who is guiding the Commonwealth along the right path, steering it to greater prosperity. So it's partly within this sort of thing that you have this consideration of Romulus as a name. Where are we going? Now, Augustus does, again, famously in the Res Gestae, he talks about all the things he built. There's a tag in Suetonius that he found the city made of brick, left it built of marble. Now, one thing to remember, for those of you who go to Rome today, you will see lots of brick buildings, because very often the facades have been removed. The brick you see there is a rather later development that comes in the course of the 1st and into the 2nd century AD, and it's incredibly resilient. It's this technique they developed for making this very, very tough brick, and they build a lot from it. That's why it's still there today. The bricks Augustus is talking about is the sort of mud brick, far less durable than you had before. So he does take Rome from being a fairly dingy city for the control, the heart of this great Mediterranean turning into a world empire, and starts to make it something far more spectacular. There is an immense amount of building in Rome under Augustus. You can only see parts of this now. If you'd stood in the Forum by AD 14 when Augustus died and looked in any direction, you would see some monument to Augustus, some building he'd either restored or built from scratch. He completes the Forum of Julius Caesar, very little of which can be seen that clearly. It's sort of around the Senate House and that area, and then under the Mussolini Road. The other side of that road, you've got the Forum of Augustus that he will construct. And one interesting detail, if you go to the corner near the Temple of Mars Ultor, you'll see that there's a high wall surrounding all of this. So it meant that it was cut off from fire risk, but also you didn't have to see some of the sort of crowded, almost slum housing beyond that as you go towards the slope starts to go up. But it's not a square corner, because Augustus bought up the property on which he was going to build the Augustan Forum, and the owner of that particular bit wouldn't sell. So rather than as the man who's Augustus, princeps, all of these things, compelling a Roman citizen to sell you something when he didn't want to, Augustus built around it, basically. So it emphasized two things: A, the great power, the great wealth, the great benefits I'm giving to the city, but also I am respecting the rights of individual Roman citizens in how I'm doing this. Again, we'll talk more about the Temple of Mars Ultor in the next session about the provinces. It's where they put the standards they brought back from the east and elsewhere. It's a huge development. This is only a reflection elsewhere throughout the empire, particularly in Roman communities, colonies and the like. There's a huge amount of building. There's restoration work. Agrippa will take over and repair the sewer system and the water supply system of Rome. There are stories of him sort of rowing about in the sewers to inspect. You build more aqueducts, you repair the other ones, you get fresh water into the city, you're flushing out the waste products, you are building bridges, roads, repairing the ones that need it, and everywhere you go, Augustus's name is on this, and often his image is there too. In the same way that he is Julius Caesar was the first living Roman to have his image put on coins, but only some coins. Augustus's image and name is on every silver coin minted in the empire in this period, and a vast amount of coinage is minted at this time. Now, all stuff is still in circulation. The Romans don't throw away a coin simply because it's old, but Augustus is everywhere. And when in the New Testament, you have the story about Jesus being asked about taxation and whether or not they should pay it. Show me a coin whose head is on the coin, Caesar's. Even though that story is set in the reign of Tiberius, the image you would see if you looked at a coin was 90% likely to be Augustus even at that time, because so much was minted at that point. So gold and silver, he's there, and he's on most of the bronze as well. There are a few exceptions to that, but it's overwhelmingly there. His statue is everywhere, and his name is everywhere. So wherever you look, whatever you do, you're reminded of, we have all these great things because Augustus has got things going again, and he's provided them for us, and he is looking after all of us. There's an example of this sort of ideology when in his last days he's sailing along the coast of Italy, and a grain ship coming from Egypt passes the vessel he's on. They learn the emperor's on board, and they cry out and praise him for making the seas safe to travel. There's that sense, you talk about the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, sometimes it's the Augustan peace. Everything is restored. There's stability, there's peace, there is safety, there is security, and practically things work again. Building is done better. The city is better cared for, better provided, the amenities work, and it extends to the big entertainments and the theatres and the chariot racing venues and all this sort of things, but also to the very basic things of sewers and water. So he is doing that, but he is putting his name, his image, absolutely everywhere. Now, an aside to this, before I go on to the importance of the image, remember that all this work requires workers to do it. And overwhelmingly, this is not, Rome doesn't work on slave labour, particularly for building projects. There will be some specialist slaves probably involved, but overwhelmingly you are giving jobs to the wider population. So you're employing people to do this. So you're giving the community something that's actually useful, but you're also giving them pay and employment in the meantime in labouring on it. So it works on two levels, and then of course all the time your name, your image is there, and that image never ever ages. It's always youthful. People would have been most surprised to meet Augustus in his later years, realizing that he wasn't very tall, he didn't have great skin, he had rather poor teeth. Suetonius tells a story that he had some platform sandals he used to wear to make himself look a bit taller. And he's old, but his image in public, the one you see if you're not actually in Rome or where he visits, is of this perpetually youthful man. It's almost sort of ageless. It's not quite the teenager or the man in his early 20s. It's just this serene figure, in contrast to, say, the images of Julius Caesar, where his age was emphasized, and that was the tradition in Roman art. You know, you get those rather craggy, round-faced Romans glowering out at you from monuments. Sometimes it's because the portraits were done from funeral masks, but nevertheless it's also that warts and all approach the Romans seem to have had. So you have all of this, and Augustus's name is there everywhere. His image is everywhere. You see him, you're reminded of him. It extends to his family. Livia, his wife, will appear again very, very frequently. To some extent Octavia, his sister, Agrippa, his chief associate, subsequently son-in-law. We'll get onto the family in due course. All of these people, their images, their names are everywhere. They're putting things up. Agrippa is very careful that he doesn't take triumphs. He gets them voted to him again and again. He just gets the job done. The glory goes to Augustus, and then he moves on to the next task. But it's everything is associated with him, and that's most marked in the heart of Rome itself. In the Forum, rostra there, built by Augustus. Senate House, completed by Augustus. Other buildings, other basilicas, many associated with big names from Republican history, he restores, and he puts up arches celebrating successes in Parthia and elsewhere. If you come along the Sacra Via, that sacred road through the heart of Rome, leads up towards the Capitol, the pathway for a triumph, for other ceremonial processions, Augustus is everywhere. You're looking, you're reminded of him at every point. And you've got the amenities, you've got the organisation, you've divided the city up into the 14 regions. The vigiles, the urban cohorts are based around that, how they administer them as well and control them. You're up there on the Palatine Hill, away from the other senators' houses which are nearer the Sacra Via, but progression from them. It's moving along. Your lifestyle you emphasise of living a simple life and living the ideal life of a good Roman. Family is very, very important. Of course, that becomes a complicated thing, as we'll see in a moment. You're supposed to wear tunics that have been woven by the women of your own household. You don't eat the excessively fancy, exotic food, the peacocks and things like that, and the exotic fish of Lucullus and the other fish fanciers that Cicero and others deride. The exceptionally wealthy of the late Republic who'd indulged themselves in their villas, their luxury houses, their art, their food. Everything is simpler. Everything is on display. Emphasis on marriage, production of children. Laws are passed to encourage people to reward you if you have 3 or more children as Roman citizens. And there are continual complaints from Augustus that the aristocracy is not playing their part, that they're not having children, that we need more Romans to go on and do things. It's a surprisingly modern problem in the sense that the more settled and prosperous a society becomes, the less it actually wants to produce offspring. Partly because it doesn't need them for labour force of peasant agriculture, but also the sense that, oh well, I can't give the best to all of them, so if I only have 1 son instead of 3, it's cheaper, but I can afford to give him more. Augustus is trying to, it's renewal in every respect. So I've found Rome brick and made it marble. I've got things working again. I am Augustus. This is a return to the past. There is a great emphasis on revival of tradition, the old way of doing things, restoring old buildings. All of this is going on. Augustus is pitching himself, as many radical leaders do, as a man who's actually restoring things to the past rather than innovating. All these institutions, the secular games based on this cycle, the fetial law for declaring war, he creates old, or takes old things, quite probably remodels them extensively, but presents this as, this is a renewal. This is getting back to the good old days. This is what I'm doing. We are now more Roman than we've ever been before, more traditional. In a society like the Roman one, which has immense respect for the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, the good old days, this sense that things are gradually getting worse, this is an attempt to put the clock back and actually go back to all the things that made Rome successful, made Rome great, gave the Romans this special relationship with the gods that allowed them to be so successful. So you have Augustus appearing everywhere. Essentially his name, his image, it's on the coins, there's statues, there's paintings, there's inscriptions, with the renewal, all the physical renewal of the building program, then the spiritual renewal. A lot of the building program is also, as noted in the Res Gestae, restoration of temples, and a sense that not just the physical homes of the gods in your city, but also the cults, the rituals associated with them are all renewed, revived, done as they should be, restoring that proper relationship with the gods of the Roman people. You've also got the literature, of course. So this is one of the great flowerings of Latin literature in particular, where you have poets like Virgil and Horace, particularly associated with Augustus. These are invited to dine with him. He takes an interest with them. Maecenas, again, his friend, his sort of confederate with Agrippa, one of the senior advisors in those early days, though again he doesn't really have a formal role, unlike Agrippa, is seen as a patron of the arts, and in particular of writers and poets. In the Aeneid you have an epic with obviously the theme, these are Trojan refugees under Aeneas. It doesn't go to the founding of Rome, it goes to set things up for the descendants that will eventually be with Romulus, will come along and found Rome. It is a remarkable piece of work. I mean, it looks as if Virgil spent sort of on average a day to write 1 or 2 lines of verse. It doesn't always come through in the translation. The Latin has a beauty to it that is quite remarkable. And it's an odd mixture in that obviously it's very Homeric. There are elements of the Iliad and the Odyssey in it, because you have a bit about, they tell the story of the fall of Troy. You have battles in it that are very much like those of the Iliad, where individual heroes go on the rampage, slaughtering all before all them. You get the introduction and so, a few epithets about him, and then bang, dead. As you move on, it ends with the big confrontation between Aeneas and Turnus. But there is clearly an element of the glory of Rome that will come. You have Jupiter talking about, again, the conquered and the proud, where we get the title for this series from, comes from that. This will be the destiny of the Romans, to bring law, to bring order, spare the conquered, overcome the proud in war. Jupiter will set no limit to their power, to their empire, all of this sort of thing. And Aeneas, there's a counterpart to Augustus in that he's the hero who has to do some fairly dirty things and isn't always perfect, isn't as flawless, but is a lot less devoted to personal honour compared to the heroes of Homer, the Basileus class you have there, and which seems to reflect society in archaic Greece, at least to some extent, where it's all about personal honour. After all, the whole premise of the Iliad is the dispute over personal honour between Achilles and Agamemnon, and the ramifications of that. Aeneas does unpleasant things. He has this affair with Dido and then abandons her because that's his destiny. He can't settle the Trojan refugees in Carthage in North Africa. They have to go to Italy. They have to found Rome. And you have the really tragic scenes with Dido and her suicide as a result of this. Yes, she curses Rome, but this is the truth about about Virgil and the Aeneid in particular, but more generally this poetry, in that while it is the sort of stuff that the new regime would love to have, and people could draw a parallel between Aeneas and Augustus. I've got my hands dirty, but I have restored Rome. I'm leading Rome on to this greater future. In the same way of Aeneas, I've done some dodgy things. I've sometimes, I've been prostrate in terror during a storm at sea. Rumours about Augustus and his physical courage, particularly in some of the sea battles, but also at other times. You can draw all those parallels, but this remains a remarkably fine piece of art, or of literature. And it's more complex, because someone like Dido, it's hard not to read that, I think even for a Roman at the time, and not feel immense sympathy to this poor woman who is, a widow, but has done the very best for her people and has established her people in Carthage, gone without, sacrificed herself for the wider good, and then has this one moment of actually she gets something in her life, she gets this love affair, this pleasure, and then it all turns very sour and very nasty. It isn't simple. Virgil's story is complex, and you have the ambiguity of the final scene when Aeneas confronts Turnus. You have this last duel, like the gunfight at the end of a Western is a common enough parallel, and Turnus is defeated, he's lying on the ground, he begs for mercy to be spared, promises to sort of, be an ally from now on. Aeneas is about to spare him. He then sees the baldric, the scabbard that's been taken off a young warrior who's been killed, and instead of sparing him, he kills Turnus, and his soul goes down to the underworld, and the epic ends. And that does seem to be where Virgil intended. Virgil asked apparently for the manuscript to be burned as soon as he died, because he didn't think it was perfect, it wasn't quite ready. It's hard to think that there was going to be a drastic change around of the plot at that point. So you end with an ambiguity. Yes, Aeneas has pushed the thing through. This is someone who needed to be killed, an enemy who's done terrible things up to this point. And yet there's the consideration of mercy, and then, no, I'm going to kill him. But is that right? Is that simple? I suspect the genius of somebody like Maecenas, and to an extent Augustus, is that they tried to find talented people and encourage them to write, but largely let them do their own thing. I don't buy these ideas that see this as simple propaganda and direct propaganda. It's certainly flattering to the new regime, it's encouraging, but it's much more complicated than that. And you can see it, and it is more effective in giving a positive message for the regime, because it isn't simple, because it isn't just crude. So it's not tightly controlled, but there is a great emphasis on the past. Recent history tends to be ignored. It's back to the good old days. You have Livy's history of the Roman people from the foundation of the city. Now, this did go up to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. And there is a view that Livy was quite sympathetic to Pompey and all this sort of thing, and critical of Julius Caesar, a view that I think is pushed too far. But again, it's an emphasis on the good old days, how we got to be as great and as wonderful as we are, the traditions that we need to revive. Much of it is a celebration of Rome's past, of wars, of victories, of the heroes who led Rome at different times, but have served Rome. This is not a story of kings and great warriors so much as elected magistrates, elected commanders, and it's all, again, you can perceive this as leading towards Augustus. It's a theme we'll come back to when we look at the imperial aspect, the expansion aspect, in the next talk in this series. But there is also a counterculture going on, if you can call it that. You have poets like Propertius, even more Ovid. Ovid will, of course, eventually end up being exiled, who don't write about patriotic themes in quite the same way. Occasionally, in the Fasti, for instance, of Ovid, you will have talk of temples and symbols of triumph and victory and all this sort of thing, and a celebration of peace that Augustus has brought. But then there's a lot of stuff about affairs and drinking, and particularly, you have the ars amatoria, the art, the skills of love, that he sort of, Ovid sets up as it's meant to be amusing, it's meant to be entertaining, but as a sort of an alternative to go off and serve the state as a soldier. It's, well, go and, fight the wars of love here. It's, while it deals with sex and things like that, it has rather more to do with seduction and affairs and ending affairs, starting affairs. It has sort of, there's something in common with some of those slightly creepy swinging bachelor films of the 1960s, although those of course tend to end with the hero and the heroine going off and deciding that actually yes, they want to have a proper love rather than just affairs. Now that's obviously a direct threat to the moral legislation that emphasises marriage, child bearing, big families, encouraging you to produce children and live as stable Roman families should. We'll come on to the family question in a moment. I think actually we'll do it as a separate talk. But so you have this going on, and we'll look in more detail at some of this on in other occasions, because this lecture's already too long. So we'll look at some of the poetry, we'll look at some of these cultural aspects of what's going on, because it is fascinating stuff, and that whether it'll fit into this series or I'll put it in a separate talk, it's definitely worth doing. So you have two sides. Ovid will get himself exiled to the Black Sea and then writes all those depressing poems from there, complaining about please let me come home and it's horrible here and I'm the barbarian here because I'm understood by no one, and talking about these sort of women warriors riding down the street with bows on their back and all this sort of thing. It's just an alien world to him. Quite what context, there seems to have been some scandal involving a female member of the imperial household that Ovid got caught up in. Details of that, but the pronounced reason is that it's he's corrupting the morals of the youth and all this sort of thing, which you can see Augustus's point of view in the type of thing is definitely not the official line, but nevertheless it's a sign of that flourishing. There is a beauty to his language, to his words, to his rhythms, to the verse. These are artists of great talent, and the literature tends to survive. It's probably also reflected in the painted arts and the other things as well that don't, on the whole, to quite the same extent. Right, Augustus is complaining in the background. I'm not quite sure what he wants at the moment, but again, apologies for the usual descant provided by Cat that you might be able to hear because he's off in the corridor outside. So I think we'll draw this to a conclusion now. There's far more detail we could go into about so many aspects of this, and we will at sometimes some of these topics we'll look at, as I say, we'll look a bit more at the poets and the literature on another day, and also the social implications, the sort of things that Ovid's talking about in the Ars Armatoria and elsewhere, how that reflects on the ideals of how Romans, and particularly aristocratic and wealthy Romans, should behave. The reality as opposed to whether the propaganda or the stylized portrayal within literature that tends towards the exaggeration, because it's supposed to be the exceptional, not the everyday. So you have the Ovid, how to pick women up when attending the circus and this sort of thing. So we'll look at all of that, but we'll do that another time, because I think we've already covered a fair bit. We've covered quite a few different topics. There's a lot to take in. This should give us some sense of the political regime that's established, the great change that occurs under Augustus, and that will largely follow through with his successors. But we'll talk, next time we'll do a shorter one just on Augustus and his family, and the apparently very high death rate that seems to go on, and then of course the I Claudia stuff, and the rumours that Livia or somebody else is behind all of this. I was going to do that as part of this talk, but I think it's better separated off. And we'll also do the main next talk in The Conquered and the Proud will be Augustus and the provinces, Augustus and the empire, and then we'll look more at people like Agrippa, Tiberius, Drusus, Germanicus, some of the other key figures that play a role in all of this. So for the moment, that's it for today, and then, as I say, in a few days' time we'll have this shorter video about Augustus and his family. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching.